Hello, welcome to Light from Light. My name's Daniel and his name is
Brother Thomas Torres.
Welcome back to another episode. It's been a while since we had an episode on the channel, on the podcast. Our last episode was St. Aelred, although we did try and record an episode on St. Thomas Aquinas, but
Dan came for, you were here pretty much for the whole day, weren't you? And
yeah.
the plan was to record 2 episodes and we didn't even record one because it was just it was bad.
We spent like 3 or 4 hours trying to record an episode on St. Thomas Aquinas, who obviously Brother Thomas loves because he's he's named after him, is his namesake. Fellow Dominican, but I think we were both just so tired.
We were really tired, especially by the end. We were really, really tired.
Yeah.
I think it's also, sometimes when you know a lot about a particular thing, knowing what to leave out is actually quite difficult, because you can find something really interesting and then you can go into it and then you can think, actually, this is probably a bit convoluted for a wider audience. It's going to be a bit niche, some of the things that I said. So I was like, maybe this maybe this isn't great. Maybe we should start again. So instead, because St. Thomas is now we're in February, and the idea was that the episode was going to be brought out for his feast day on the 29th of January. We decided that we would record a completely different episode, and we'll come back to St. Thomas, of course.
Yeah, I mean, he comes up so
all
often
the time
on so many different subjects. He's sort of weaved through.
And there's a lot out there
subjects
on St. Thomas from other platforms as well. Aquinas 101, the Aquinas Institute, the Thomistic Institute, for example.
Product placement here.
Product placement, yeah. There's a lot.
My product placement.
Blank mug. I prefer the blank ones.
Yeah. But today's episode is actually on a saint who isn't as well known as St. Thomas Aquinas. We're known in little pockets, but it's still a very important saint. I say that, but every saint is important. But this particular saint is, I think, of particular importance for our day and age. We'll go on to why that is, and that saint is
Saint Josephine Bakhita.
Yeah, the wonderful first saint of Sudan. So,
I didn't know that. That is interesting.
The country of Sudan. I think little pockets might know of this saint, Saint Josephine. She lived. She was born in the 19th century and lived into the 20th century. She actually died around like mid 1940s. So just around the Second World War, which surprised me actually. I didn't realize she lived that.
We used to be much
late.
better, didn't we? At making films and writing books about saints that were actually, like, for example, books of saint stories that were read to children, for example, when they were at their mother's knee, and making like films and stuff about saints and things. There are some saints that we know loads about, and I think it's partly because we publish and produce so much media about them and spread their devotion. Whereas actually with a lot of saints, really great saints, especially in the modern era, people like Blessed Carlo Acutis and Josephine Bakhita and Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, there are things out there and you've sort of heard about them, but not in the same sort of depth and detail that we've heard about some of those classic saints like St. Francis of Assisi, for example, who's had multiple films and multiple books written about his life, multiple historical records that are really in depth and very detailed.
I think
that is.
I think so, when I think of Saint Josephine Bakhita, I think she is a saint really for this time, like the prominence of the fact that she came from being a slave to being a free woman, and that story we'll get into it a bit later, but that story I think has particular significance for our day and age when there's huge swathes of people who are in human trafficking and organ harvesting and things like this. I think her story and the prominence and the prevalence of that we experience now in this day and age has that sort of link. So I think her significance is more now than perhaps it was in her life or shortly after her life. But saying that, she was very popular around where she died, where she lived and died in the last part of her life. So she was born in Sudan, but she eventually ended up in Italy, in around Venice sort of area, and she was very, very popular in that area and in Italy as well. So you might know of her if you're from Italian heritage and Italian background. You might know of her if you have links to maybe Africa, that part of Africa, part of Sudan itself. You might have heard of her because Pope Francis has really took it up in his pontificate to speak out about human trafficking, about modern day slavery, and he often cites her story. And there's little pockets of devotion you find in America, you find in Canada, parts like that, and here in London as well. So I'm where I work.
London.
Yeah,
We're
I
in
just realised we're in Oxford.
We're in Oxford. Here in London, yeah, like with massive. Well, we don't have anything that sort of shows that we're in Oxford, I guess. So.
We're in Oxford, but I work in London.
Yeah,
and I work in for the Diocese of Westminster. Well, I work in a parish that's in the Diocese of Westminster, and they have a Caritas initiative which is called Bakhita House. So you may have heard of St. Josephine Bakhita because of that, because of the great work that they do. But yeah, before we get onto any of that, then should we speak a little bit about her early childhood and how she grew up? So, there's not much to say really about her early childhood. There's not really much much
other than
known.
She was happy.
Yeah,
she had a happy childhood. Her father was the brother of the chief of a tribe or something, wasn't it? And she has an autobiography, if I'm not mistaken. She has an autobiography, but she didn't write it herself.
Yeah, that's right. So she writes this. It's written later in her.
Which is sorry,
life.
I just realised I said she has an autobiography, but she didn't write it herself. What I mean is, because an autobiography, of course, is written by the person themselves.
It's a first-hand account.
Yeah, because she can't
account.
herself write. She never learned to write. Is that right? I think that's right.
Yeah. What, right or right?
Right.
I think so. When she later in life, she was taught how to read and write, but she couldn't pick it up very well. So when it came to her story and her account of her story, she
dictated it to somebody else.
Yeah, through a series of interviews that she did. But yeah, so that her early childhood was very happy. So she tells in this autobiography of a very happy childhood with her family, very close with her family and siblings and cousins, and they, yeah, it's just a family full of joy. And even at that point, I think she was very marked by this joy of life. But there were a couple of very traumatic experiences that she had in this early childhood. So as she was out walking one day, she witnessed the abduction of I think it was one of her cousins. So she saw this like firsthand. One of her
older
cousins
sister, I think, was abducted as well, wasn't she?
Ah, okay.
But I don't know whether she witnessed that. This could have been a separate incident. But I'm pretty sure her older sister was abducted 2 years before she was.
Yeah, and that was the second traumatic experience. Was her abduction.
Was her abduction.
Yeah. So her abduction by slave traders. So they abducted her. They sold her into slavery. But it had such a traumatic impact on her that she actually forgot her name. So her name from birth wasn't Bakhita. It wasn't her childhood name or a family name, but it was the name that it was given to her as an Arabic name, meaning lucky, which is hugely ironic. But this is the name. They asked her what her name was. She couldn't remember. She couldn't remember the date of her birth even. Right. Yeah. Which maybe is a bit more common at that time, but she couldn't remember much of her childhood.
And at the end of her life as well, when she's on her deathbed, she has flashbacks to some of the traumatic episodes that she endured in slavery. Like she starts talking about how the chains are too tight, the shackles are too tight, and things like that at the very end of her life when she's on her deathbed. So she's still sort of having those flashbacks, those psychological and emotional traumas, those physical traumas as well, come back to her in later life. Yeah,
trauma sort of stays with her throughout life, marks her life really. But I think it's incredible that she loses her identity in essence. So physically she's taken away from her family, but also a lot of these childhood memories are forgotten. Even her name, like it's epitomized in her name.
Yeah.
And then she's given this name, Bakhita, from an Arabic word meaning lucky or fortunate, which is, incredibly ironic, but then that becomes her name. And she's treated like brutally. She's treated horrifically, and she accounts this in this autobiography that she has, and she's passed on from slave owner to slave owner
3 times. I think she gets passed to somebody else, and at some point in this time, she's forcibly converted to Islam during this time, which may be where the name Bakhita comes from, with it being an Arabic name meaning fortunate.
So and all of this is in Sudan, so she's still in the same area, and then eventually she ends up being sold to an Italian family, an Italian consul, and they're living in Sudan. His name was Calixto Liganini. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but he was Josephine Bakhita described him as a kind man. I mean, it's all relative because he was a slave owner.
Compared to what she had known before in the brutality.
And the way she's described it, she said that this time I really was the fortunate one. So play on her name there. This time I really was the fortunate one because the new master was a very good man, and he started to like me, and I was not punished or whipped. So that it seemed so unreal to me, being able to enjoy such peace and tranquility at that time. I mean, she goes from
I
such
think before this period, it sounds to me like she's in a sort of flight or fight. So I mean, obviously she can't fly, but it strikes me that she's in sort of a heightened state of awareness because she's constantly in danger and constantly worried for her safety. So she has to be hyper vigilant to her surroundings and what's going on in her immediate vicinity. And I think that perhaps it's, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but perhaps that focus on, I mean, when something dangerous or something big happens, something like an explosion goes off or something, all of your senses get directed at the threat, what the threat is. Whereas she's living in a perpetual state of threat. So I wonder whether her senses, her memories, everything get just focused on that one point.
On surviving.
Which
is why she forgets her name, forgets her happy childhood.
And then the contrasting then her experiences previously with the people who she was with this Italian family who are named. Interestingly, the others aren't named. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. She doesn't remember the names of. Well, I don't know. Maybe she did remember them, but she doesn't name them in her account. So this, war breaks out in Sudan, and then this Italian family go back to Italy, and they take Josephine Bakhita and some of the other slaves who they own at this time. They take them back to Italy, and it's there that Bakhita's given roles which are more caring and nurturing. So she is given the responsibility of looking after the children. So she becomes very well known for this later in life. I mean, children absolutely love her. Later in life, they flock to her as she's a free woman, as a religious woman. But she serves as a nanny then during this time, and she is much loved by the family. And during that time in Italy, then she comes across some very important people who play an important role in her conversion. And the first person who introduces her really to Christianity is another worker at the estate. So he was an estate manager, and he introduced Josephine Bakhita to the life of Christ. So told her stories of the life of Christ, taught her how to pray. And she said that he one day gave her a crucifix, and she used to wear it around her neck and hide it away. And she said it's the first thing I was ever able to hide away, and it became a source of great peace that I'd look at the one who also suffered and find great peace that he was there with me in my suffering. So a beautiful expression of that. But this man wasn't a man who introduced Christianity to her, he wasn't a free man himself. He was the estate manager, but he worked for the family. But he wasn't a religious either. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't a sister, and he was just a lay person. But not just a lay person. Lay people are so important. Is my point. Lay people are so important at handing on the faith, and you see that here with Bakhita. That was the first introduction to the person of Christ, was through a lay person. Incredible, huh?
Yeah.
But then she is exposed to religious sisters. So then she gets to know this community of religious sisters. I can't remember the name. You remember the name of
I can't remember their names either. This is going to be really awful.
I remember the name of the order. Did you write it down?
Canosian sisters or something? Or I was calling them the Carbonara sisters for a while, and that's really awful. Not only because they're Italian, but it begins with a C. I think it's the Canosian sisters or something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head. But they have a lovely role in the local area. So they care for those who are poorly, who are sick, and they care for children as well. And she's very Bakhita at this time gets to know them and is very impressed with their love of, like, their genuine love of children, their genuine love and care for those in need, and from what that's sort of begins in is their love of God. So this is like deeply impresses upon her, and she spends a lot of time with them, and as a result of that, she encounters God. She becomes a Christian during that time as well, which is very beautiful. And she has a lovely way of describing it in her autobiography. So she said that through this experience she encountered God, and she recognized the God that she had experienced in her heart without knowing who it was. So since her childhood, those childhood sort of memories, the little patches that she did remember of her family, and then throughout the hardships as well that she experienced, she realized that there was a God, there was someone there with me throughout all of this.
She says something.
This person was Christ, who she realizes later. Yeah.
She says something very similar about Mary. She says that Mary protected me before I even knew her. She says is one of the interesting things that she says. But it's quite interesting that she says this, considering the sorts of tortures that she put up with. Like, I think before, maybe it was the last person who she was with before the Italian family, there was a woman who brought a razor, a long sort of sharp razor, like the sort of ones where the really long ones. Flour and salt and things, and they traced like symbols over her body, and then took the razor and cut really deep wounds on her flesh, and then put salt in them to make sure that they would permanently scar, which is an agony. And she said she thought she was going to die because it was just so much pain.
Yeah, I think it's accounted that it's like over 100 scars that she had at that one, at that one time, on that one crazy occasion. Awful, yeah. And flour as well, salt and flour.
I thought the flour was to trace the images, okay. So then that way they could stick the knife in, basically. Awful. But it's interesting that even with all of these things, that she still finds gratitude and solace, and she can still find peace, and that she still believes that God was with her in those moments, and that Mary was protecting her before she knew her by name. I thought that was a very interesting thing. Another interesting thing which strikes me from what you've said, that not only is the cross probably one of the first things actually that was hers to own as hers, and I wonder if this is one of the reasons that maybe she kept it hidden, but also it strikes me that whereas she was forcibly converted to Islam, Catholicism was something she chose. She, in her freedom, in the freedom of her heart, in her will, she chose Christ. She chose Christianity. She chose to be a Catholic. She wasn't forcibly converted to Catholicism. She chose it freely. There was something about it that she loved. And I think that she found a certain liberty in her faith as a Catholic. Yeah.
Absolutely. She after she was baptized, well, she takes the name Josephina at that point, Saint Josephina, when she's baptized. But it's said that daily she would go to the church where she was baptized and go to the font and would hug the font, embrace the font, and say, this is the point. Like, here is where I became a daughter of God. This is where I found like my identity. It's where I found my name.
Yeah.
Josephine. It's where I found freedom. By that point she was still a slave, so physically still a slave, but interiorly found this freedom in Christ.
Through her baptism, through her entry into the church.
Yeah.
She found a new identity and liberty and a name. And the church also has something to do with her actually becoming liberated in the end, doesn't it? I mean, like legally, the church had a role to play in that, didn't it? Yeah.
So she, just to say, so on the day she was baptized, so she then took that day as her birthday, and she would say, this was the day I was born. I was born a child of God. I was born into the family of God. I was given a mother, Mary. I'd lost my mother. That was taken away from me. Now I was given a mother, so that was very, very important as a thing for her. So I think it was something like the 9th of January was the day she was baptized, and she took that then to be her birthday because she couldn't remember her birthday. And
she was given a mother that nobody could take from her. She was given a name.
Yeah, the Father.
God the Father. Interesting.
Yeah, and you're right. So the church fought for her freedom. So the Italian family were going to move again. So they did move again, and they wanted to take Josephine Bakhita with them. And she said she didn't want to go, that she wanted to stay there in this place. And then so this went to court, and it was the church who helped support her through the court system. So she found freedom through the court system.
It was through the same sisters, wasn't it? Was it? The catechumenate or something. Was this before she was baptized, or maybe just after or something? But basically, somebody who represents the catechumenate, like the superior of the people who are preparing to be baptized, complained, didn't he, to the government, and she went before the Attorney General of the King of Italy or something. And it was then that they said something like, well, when she was born, even before she was born, England had outlawed slavery. In Italy, slavery had never been legal to own slaves, because it was a sort of it had just never been in the law that it was something you could do. So basically he just sort of said, well, legally we don't actually recognize slavery. The place where you were when there was English rule and things in Africa, in parts of Africa, that slavery had also been abolished there at the time that she was born. So then the Attorney General and the court basically ruled that she was in fact not legally a slave. So she was legally already a free person. It's interesting, really.
Yeah, isn't it? But the church played a role in supporting that.
That was why it went to court. Sisters. It went to court because somebody who was involved in the catechumenate there, preparing people to be baptized, fought for it basically to go to court, and it did. Thank God.
Yeah.
And the court
and she was free.
Said, well, yeah, she's free.
And so for the rest of her life, then she stayed with the sisters. She became a religious sister herself. She became a nun, and she stayed there for the rest of her life. And she was a part of the work of the sisters and cared for the children. And it said that they deeply loved her. And she always had this joyful disposition, this joyful character, this welcoming spirit. She was also part of the welcome for any visitors that would come to stay with the sisters. She would greet them, she would welcome them, and this is why if you see images of her, she's often depicted with a sunflower, because
I didn't know that.
Yeah, cheerful disposition that she
Interesting.
has. Yeah, and she also has, there's lovely images of her where, well, it's lovely because she's depicted as having chains around her arms, but they're dissolving, so you see them like fading away, and she's often looking at a cross. So as she looks at Christ, these chains fade away.
Interesting.
Yeah, so very beautiful depiction of it.
I think she also has a she has a sort of freedom whereby she also forgives people the incredible debt that they owe to her, essentially, you know.
Yeah.
She speaks about if she were ever to meet the people who had enslaved her, that she would kiss their hands because it was because of what they had done, the evil that they had perpetrated, that actually she found her way to Christ. It's not quite writing straight with crooked lines. It's more a remarkable gesture of forgiveness, and a recognition that in all of these things, God's purpose for her to be united to him still could not be frustrated, even by their great evil.
Yeah.
Remarkable.
As you said, well, it's certain gratitude, isn't it? It's a gratitude for that in a way. But the thing that I take from that as well is that in forgiveness is found freedom. You know, she's able to forgive them and be able to be freed from that, and as a result of that is then able to heal over time. You know, and these are, I mean, they're
if
brutal,
anybody
traumatic.
had a reason to be resentful of life, of God, of her fellow human beings, it would be St. Josephine Bakhita. You know, 100 and whatever it was scars, 114 scars or something over her body, with salt being rubbed into her wounds, being traded, you know, 3 times by Arabic traders and people, you know,
different slave owners.
Just if anyone had a reason to bear it, to bear resentment to their neighbor, to their fellow human being, to God, it would be her. But she was remarkably free, even in spite of all of the things that she had endured and the psychological torments that she endured. She was, in mind and heart, free. And I think part of that freedom, you're right, comes from her ability to forgive. And it's not saying that these things were justified in any way, that how she was treated was in any way justifiable. And I think shows that she herself also had power there. The power to forgive is a very real power.
I think that's what it's to say. It's not easy. Like she didn't find this easy. She was still marked by the trauma of this, you know, nightmares at night. Certainly when she was dying, by that point, late in her life, she still had flashbacks to these horrible experiences. But I suppose the point is that in choosing forgiveness, she was able to have certain power over these experiences, which in essence she didn't have power over physically, but she was able to take power over them, and was able to also find freedom in them. Freedom from being a prisoner to the things that we can't control,
and a certain amount of peace, you know, because she herself speaks about peace at the same time as having these flashbacks that now we might even diagnose with something like post-traumatic stress disorder, you know. But even with all of these experiences, she still feels at peace, you know, and grateful for the life that she now has with the sisters.
Yeah. And so so then after she converts and becomes a nun, this great story of her life, this amazing story, is put down in writing. So it's almost out of obedience. So she didn't want to tell people, like, they didn't want this to be a widely known story. But the other sisters saw the amazing thing that God was doing in her life, and out of obedience then, so she agreed to tell this story. And so it was written down and it was published, and as a result of that, she would go around the country, travel quite far around Italy, telling this story. And even when she got poorly, she ended up in a wheelchair. She had bad health as a result of her being in slavery, and all these horrible experiences. She then, even in a wheelchair, traveled to share this story. And there are multiple accounts of people who heard this story and were brought to conversion themselves because of this amazing history that she had. So then she gets very very frail, and she dies. And the last words of her, the last words that she says from her lips are "Madonna, Madonna." Isn't that beautiful? They're the last words that she says. Madonna, Madonna. Yeah, embracing the mother who she chose, who was given to her. It couldn't be taken away. And so we're going to wrap up the episode there. But just to say that there are huge amounts of resources which are available. So we're gonna put some of them in the description for the episode, so you can hear the bell ringing. If you can hear the bell,
I've got to run. That's
yeah. So we're going to wrap up the episode there, but please have a look at those notes, because they're really useful. And until next time, we'll be back with another episode.
God bless you.
God bless.